what are the dark patterns that occur with recommendation systems? The basis of recommendation systems are the concepts around similarity and vector databases. And we know some of the technical components from a previous podcast, but let's get into the harms that are documented and maybe potentially some ways to mitigate them. So first up, the fundamental mechanism of manipulation with one of these systems is that the engagement optimization pathology. So the recommendation engine itself is optimized for engagement. So time on site, clicks, shares. And if that's the only thing you're measuring, there could be some problems. One of them is from a mathematical component, the emotional triggers are the ones that have the higher engagement gradient. So anger, outrage, etc. And the KPI will misalign with what actually society is looking for. So on one hand, you have the business, maybe it's Meta or a YouTube algorithm, and they're going to be optimizing for profit, but society doesn't need to optimize for profit. They want to optimize for stability and for truth. And so we have this algorithmic asymmetry where it's easier to engage with outrage than just nuance or critical thinking. We also have the neurological exploitation vectors. So the dopamine-driven feedback loops, like the phone that's constantly by your bed or that you pick up throughout the day, we see that there's lots of evidence that it can limit critical thinking. It can create an addictive pattern. And so this temporal manipulation is going to cause this reinforcement. And then also we have cortisol, adrenaline, and response to inflammatory content. And then this attention vulnerability. So human attention is zero sum, right? If you are able to recommend aggressively more and more content, then you're actually exploiting humans and addicting them for profit. Now, if we look at the technical architecture here, we have this filter bubble reinforcement. So the vector similarity, we know, right, if 9 out of the 10 items are the same, we could recommend you that 10th item. That 10th item could be a spiral down another rabbit hole of maybe misinformation or disinformation. And this recommendation diversity could be one of the ways that you could limit that. You could also identify these harmful reinforcement feedback loops. You could look at maybe a mathematical approach, right? You could balance the similarity with also exploring randomness. And then we have a preference for falsification amplification. So these supervised systems will train on the expressed behavior, not true preferences. And so this could be potentially misinterpreting the value, right? So if you're training on things that are making engagement happen, but that's actually fake information, then you're reinforcing this falsification. So what this means is that it's easy to then weaponize these vector databases. You can have coordinated inauthentic behavior, troll farms that exploit algorithmic problems, also signal injection. You could follow organic amplification. You could have a cross-platform vector propagation as well that could create a very resilient misinformation ecosystem. So you spread this message across multiple platforms, and then you have a cost asymmetry. It's easy to manipulate than it is to defend against it. We also have algorithmic vulnerability. So you could reverse engineer recommendation systems to manipulate people. You could have content policy circumvention. You could have also maximizing algorithmic propagation, time-based manipulation as well, focusing on trending. So in a nutshell, what we see here is that there actually is a documented history of this. Miramar is a good example. The Facebook recommendation system amplified this genocidal incitement. We have algorithmic acceleration of ethnic dehumanization. And these are systems that are not being policed the way they should be policed. We also have radicalization pathways as well, like YouTube recommendation, recommends extremism in 2019 research. Also, vector similarities creates ideological proximities. So, for example, you're into, martial arts, you're into weightlifting, or you're into maybe some kind of athletic program, and then you get mainlined into something that talks about that, but then starts to gently shift you to right wing ideology, then far right wing ideology, easy to then mind control someone. So the ideas here are that we do have some real critical technical vulnerabilities, and the self-induced government is really not working. And so organizations, governments need to think about how can we uh, do proper governance around these kinds of algorithmic problems, because there could be no real defense in this modern age with constant exposure to misinformation. And we're starting to get into ethical problems. And the ethical problems are that these systems are spreading misinformation and disinformation. Humanity has a right, an ethical right to truth. They also have an ethical right to not being harmed by these algorithmic uh, systems. So, for example, if a false piece of information spread and then a mob forms and destroys a building, or property or human life is harmed, that's actually ethically a result of somebody profiting from that type of misinformation. There should be a penalty for it, criminal penalties. Also, governments that are protecting their sovereignty need to look at ways to mitigate this. So I think this is really, in 2025 and beyond, we're going to see much more rigid ways of penalizing organizations that are exploiting these vulnerabilities. Now, we also see potentially foreign adversaries that profit from misinformation are going to really double down on this because it's so effective. And really, the result could be that there could be extreme countermeasures by organizations, maybe the European Union, Canada, UK, Australia, New Zealand, where they essentially have a, a wall set up against misinformation and disinformation, and penalize so heavily that kind of business model that it's not able to succeed. I think if you look at maybe poison, like pesticides, or you look at toxic elements that are put into a river or lake, I think we're really seeing something similar with digital systems and the wealth that people achieve. Like, for example, in America, the top 3 people own 50% of the wealth of the nation, right? If you compare them to, what is it, something like 200 million people, they're profiting very heavily on this misinformation. Many people that are involved in social media, and so it's very profitable to release poison. In this case, as a digital poison. So the result will have to be a very severe mitigation from sovereign nations, from democracies, and there's no alternative. The alternative, if you let it go, is this kind of poison that's spread throughout the environment. We also potentially could look at maybe mobile devices becoming a anti-pattern as well, just like we saw with smoking. So there's some very interesting problems and potentially dire problems with vector databases, recommendation engines that need to be addressed. And there's an ethical issue in terms of human rights that needs to be addressed as well. People have a right to live free from algorithmic harm, from algorithmic addiction. And these are some of the measures that need to be looked at when we're talking about the ethical components of vector databases.